After military actions against each other in recent weeks, tensions between the United States and Iran were at an all-time high and threatened to boil over into outright war. Amid Iran's recent admission that it shot down a civilian jetliner, those tensions have seemed to ease a bit, but caution remains. I sat down with Vincent Ferraro, Professor Emeritus at Mount Holyoke College, to learn more about where the two countries go from here.
The protests are from people who genuinely believe that the Iranian government tried to deceive them, because initially Iran denied responsibility. And so there is an awful lot of sentiment that the government has betrayed the interests of the people, and that's built upon the economic turmoil that's going on in the country. I mean, the protests have been going on for some time. So this was the latest catalyst. We don't know how extensive it is. We've got the news broadcasts showing large crowds in certain cities, but we don't know exactly how pervasive it is across the country as a whole. The hardliners in Iran are making the argument that the United States has organized these protests, and therefore they take it as a signal that the United States is continuing its policy of regime change in Iran.
And is that what is being portrayed on the state-run media?
Absolutely. No question about that.
Okay. And if you back up to November, there were also another series of protests as well.
Right. The economic conditions in Iran are quite bad because of the sanctions that have been imposed. So the Iranian ordinary citizen is really suffering a great deal.
But if you look at just back a week ago after Soleimani was killed, you had all of this footage of people in unity mourning in the streets that he had been killed. And then you fast forward to this week where you have people protesting. In the midst of all that, there have been two Iranian journalists who have quit, and one in particular who put something on Instagram who said, I have lied to you or told you lies for the last 13 years. Now that post has been since taken down, obviously a courageous move on her part, but now you're hearing from people who were telling you what was happening that it wasn't true.
Yeah, but I think the catalyst for that particular resignation was the fact that she had been on the air giving the government line that Iran had no responsibility whatsoever, only to be betrayed by subsequent information. And her belief was that the Iranian government had lied to her, and therefore she no longer had confidence in the network. A good thing for her to do. Her courage was really quite extraordinary. But again, I wouldn't read too much into that. I think it's really a case of a very specific event that raised an awful lot of emotions that ultimately collapsed very, very quickly.
But now there were some others who also resigned as well. So does this speak to kind of a change in how Iran will have to not only deal with the downing of the plane, but the United States, but really their own people, because a lot of their problems are coming from within?
One would think. On the other hand, this problem really strengthens the hands of the hardliners who believe that Rouhani has not been firm enough in dealing with these protests. And so it may turn out that the government could change because of the protests, or it could be that the government will change with a much harder president being installed. It's very difficult to read where we are.
Right. So last week when we were talking about the latest news in Iran, certainly with the killing of Soleimani, people were saying we're on the brink of war. Things have quieted a bit. The news cycle has shifted. Were we on the brink of war? Are we on the brink of war?
Oh, unquestionably, we are on the brink of war. It's really a question of what the Iranians are going to do next. Their initial response to the assassination of Soleimani, and I use that word knowing exactly what it means, was that this was an affront against Iranian sovereignty, an act of war, and it clearly was in many respects. I mean, imagine how Americans would have responded if the Iranians had killed the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
But let's go back to assassination, because when you mention that, and then we can go into their response, when you mention that, there's a lot of people who would disagree with you and say that this was a lawful military target and the president was well within his right, and that he was a terrorist, a known terrorist who killed hundreds of U.S. soldiers during Iraq. I think the number has been 600 that the administration has talked about. That, you know, that's one part of his resume. So why would it be considered an assassination? And what makes it different, for example, with Osama bin Laden? We knew what he was up to. We knew he was a terrorist. Was that an assassination?
Well, Osama bin Laden was a freelancer. He wasn't a representative of a state. Soleimani was. He was a general. He was second in command, basically. So we're really talking about an attack against the state of Iran as opposed to an attack against a citizen of Iran. And it's true that Soleimani was responsible for the development of IEDs, which have killed 600 Americans. But Soleimani was a soldier. I mean, what do we pay soldiers to do? I mean, the fact that he developed the IEDs simply reflects the relative military weakness of Iran vis-a-vis the United States. Soleimani was killed by a drone attack. The Iranians could argue that the drones were just as unethical a weapon of war as an IED. So, I mean, Soleimani was doing what his state asked him to do. He was a soldier. He did kill Americans, no question about that. Mm-hmm. But do we kill them because they are bad people or because they commit bad acts in the name of their state? If it's the latter, then it's an act of war, and it's assassination. It's not a legitimate use of self-defense.
Okay. And certainly, again, as I said, Jay Johnson, who was the former Homeland Security Secretary for President Obama, had said he was a lawful military target, I should say. President Trump has announced new sanctions last week. Is this it for a while? I know that Iran responded last week targeting bases. But what's next? What do you think their next move will be? Oh,
they'll use their proxies to keep attacking various American targets. I don't think there's going to be any change in Iranian behavior. If anything, the lack of response by Trump to their attack upon the military bases indicates that Trump is unwilling to use force. And this was true when the Iranians shot down the drone, when they attacked the oil tankers in the Persian Gulf. President Trump has very harsh rhetoric, but his actions don't really back up his words.
Although he did say on the campaign trail and has said he doesn't want us to get into unnecessary, unending wars. So some people might say after the drone attack and after the other attack that you mentioned that he used restraint.
But that could be true, but then why did he send 15,000 additional troops to Saudi Arabia? I mean, his policies are really incoherent. I don't really know exactly what he's trying to accomplish in the Middle East. I don't know what his policy toward Iran is.
What do you think the next move should be for the United States?
Well, I think the next move should be to try to figure out a way to work with the Europeans and the Chinese and the Russians to reestablish the nuclear deal, because that's really the nexus of it all. Understand, the nuclear deal was broken by the United States. It was not broken by Iran.
It was broken by the United States because President Trump didn't believe that it benefited the United States.
Well, President Obama used his signature to say that the American state will back up this agreement.
How do you do business with someone? I mean, going back to the assassination and knowing what some of the actors are and what they're involved in, how do you make a deal knowing what they're up to? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, how does that benefit the U.S.?
Well, it worked. I mean, all the evidence suggests that Iran did stop its nuclear program. There were inspectors there. What Trump said is that the agreement didn't solve all the problems with Iran. And I understand that. That's true. But that was all we asked the agreement to do. And that worked.